Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. Also, happy Native Prairie Appreciation Week. My name is Caitlin Rose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, James Pagé, Species at Risk and Biodiversity Specialist with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, will be speaking about Help the Bats, Citizen Science and Bat Conservation. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Don't miss our upcoming Native Prairie Speaker Series webinars. On July 9th, Joel Nicholson, Senior Wildlife Biologist with Alberta Environment and Parks, Fish and Wildlife Management, will be talking about Alberta's Greater Sage-Grouse Recovery Strategy, and that's July 9th at noon. Join us on August 20th for a webinar by the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, or ABMI, about their new Wild Tracks program and wildlife monitoring in southern Alberta. That's August 20th at noon. These presentations are free and you can watch from any location and just register through our website. If you are in the Val-Marie area, check out Dr. Jeff Holroyd's presentation about Canadian burrowing owls on July 6 at 7 p.m. and that's at Prairie Winn and Silver Sage, the Red Brick Schoolhouse on Center Street. I'd like to note that PCAP is celebrating Native Prairie Appreciation Week this week, so check out our social media for some fun facts and resources. We've got things going on throughout the week. I'd like to mention that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our gold sponsors, Crescent Point Energy, SaskPower, Sask Energy, TransCanada Corporation, and Wildlife Habitat Canada, as well as our supporting sponsor, Eco-Friendly Sask, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And just a reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of your webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. So a bit about today's presenter. Based in Ottawa, Ontario, James Pagé is the Canadian Wildlife Federation Species at Risk and Biodiversity Specialist. He carries out various projects at CWF, including bat conservation work, freshwater turtle recovery work, rare species surveys, and citizen science. James has also been the lead in Canada for the creation of iNaturalist.ca. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to James.
Hi, thanks, Caitlin. I don't have to introduce myself now, so everyone's got that bio. Thanks a lot. I am just bringing up my slideshow here so everyone can have a look. There we go. Caitlin, you can let me know if something doesn't quite look right on the screen, but I think everyone should be able to see the slideshow now.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, just my background isn't specifically in bats, but I've got into bat conservation because of my role as a species at risk person. Bats were on the radar a few years ago with the introduction of a fungus, white nose syndrome, that's shown up first of all in New York State in the US, and then it's spread up into Canada, into the East Coast, and it's kind of moving westward now. So that caught our radar as well, and they underwent an emergency assessment by the scientific body that assesses species at risk in Canada back in 2012. And after a bit of a delay and a bit of pushing by us and others, they finally got listed under the federal act. There are 3 species in particular that were hit hard that were listed as endangered. So that's kind of where I got into the bat world. And we did have, over the last couple of years, a bat conservation specialist who was a bat expert on staff for a little while, and helped kind of launch this program as well. I don't know how much everybody knows about bats. I'm going to go through a really quick kind of bat 101 basics. I'm sure everybody has a general idea of what a bat is, but I'll kind of go through some of the things, maybe lesser thought of things about bats. So bat, everybody knows them, is a mammal. They often have the misconception of being mice or rodents with wings. And I put this up just because it shows that bats are actually more closely related to horses and rhinoceros actually than they are to mice. So on the evolutionary phylogenetic tree, bats here branched off along with all these other mammal species, and rodents actually came way up over here. So they're actually quite a ways away on the phylogenetic tree. Just thought I'd put that one out there. So a bat, one of the claims to fame, of course, for bats is that they are actually the only mammal that flies. Flying squirrels do exist, but technically they don't fly, they glide. So bats can actually fly. And they do this based on their morphology. And what's interesting is their fingers actually are what make up a lot of their wing. So their wrist comes up just here, and they're actually, the extension of their wings is actually elongated fingers that then the webbing of their wing goes together with. The other claim to fame, obviously everybody knows about bats and echolocation. So they have this amazing ability to fly around at night and find tiny things like insects exactly where they are flying also, and be able to pick them out of midair in full flight. So by doing this though, they use their echolocation, they can actually track the distance, the speed of what something is moving at, the texture, and the direction it's moving, which is quite unbelievable. And bats can see, like us, but if we were to run full speed at night trying to catch something, we would inevitably smack into things and fall over and get injured. So bats similarly use the echolocation when they can't see in the darkness. And each bat has its own distinct sound. So with echolocation, and this is a way we can actually monitor bats, each bat species will have its own frequency and pitch of sound that they make. And this is a sonograph of what the sound would look like graphed based on the frequencies of the sound. So this is one species of bat. Other ones would have a higher or lower frequency and a kind of a different shape in that green and yellow area. And that's one way that, you know, our scientific technology is just kind of catching up with the bat's evolution, and all along of how they echolocate. We're able to now use special microphones and graphics to be able to actually track these and tell the different species. And there are a lot of different species. Actually, bats make up 25% of all known mammals in the world. There's more than 1,300 known bat species, and there are actually new ones being found. And there's a huge variety of variation within these species as well. So on the left side, we have what's the largest bat known in the world. It's got a wingspan of almost 6 feet. This is a fruit bat, so not one that flies around at night. It does eat fruits. And on the right side, we have the smallest bat in the world, and this is a full-grown bat called the bumblebee bat. And as you can see, it's pretty much just the size of this person's thumb as they're holding this bat. So there's a huge discrepancy, variation of different morphologies and sizes of bats all through the world. And one of the reasons they're all different is they each exploit or make use of a different niche, so a different set of resources that they can use. And that way they can coexist in in the same area and specialize on different aspects of that ecosystem. So some bats are pollinators. They will actually nectar flowers. Some bats will eat fruits. Some bats eat insects, which are all of the bats in Canada. So we don't have any pollinating bats in Canada. All of the bats we have are actually what are considered aerial insectivores, which, as I said, means they can pick out, they eat insects in mid-flight in the air. So all the species we have are those type of bats. We don't have vampire bats in North America. They're all in central. Well, there's one species in Mexico, but other than that, they're in Central and South America. Vampire bats do exist. We don't have any around here, and they actually don't really pose a threat to humans. They typically would actually land on livestock at night, make tiny little holes, and just kind of lap up the bit of blood that runs out. And there's no way they could ever eat enough to actually harm a full-grown animal of that size. So really the only danger might be an infection or disease as a result of the bite mark. But in Canada, we have a great pest control of all the bats that we have. We have 19 different species across Canada. In the prairie area, I think there'd be about eight species, depending on where you kind of draw the line. So there'd be about 8 different species in our area. And others that some of the species actually, their distribution would be right from the East Coast right through to the West Coast. So they actually exist in every province and actually up into some of the territories as well. So some of them have a wide range of that, of just even a single species. Species in Canada have a couple of different life histories, so different mechanisms on how they live. A few of our bats actually do migrate, just like birds go south. These few species do fly south for the winter. That's not the majority, but there are the 3 species, the eastern red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat do actually do that. Now, more of our Canadian species actually are hibernators, and that's typically, I think, what most people would think of when they think of bats in Canada are these bat caves, right? So in the winter, the bats are flying into the caves and overwintering in the cave. Interestingly, so the bats do actually, they overwinter, they go into what's called torpor. So it's not a true hibernation. They actually do kind of rouse a few times during the winter and fly around actually to get water throughout the winter. So within the cave. So they do kind of rouse a couple of times. If they do it too much, though, they burn up their fat reserves and can't survive the winter. So it's very tricky balance between sleeping enough and maintaining those reserves and getting up when they need to drink some water. These bats, when they go into torpor, their body temperature goes from, an average mammal like 36 degrees Celsius down. It'll drop down to like 3 or so degrees Celsius throughout while they're hibernating in these caves. And so they're doing this, as I mentioned, and as everybody knows, they hibernate in the winter, but they do have a specific cycle. So in the fall, so before they hibernate, they actually all swarm, and this is typically at the entrance to the hibernation site, so at their caves, and they will swarm and mate all together. Find their mate before entering hibernation in the winter. Then they go down into the caves, and different species will actually segregate out and hibernate in different areas of the caves. Some will go deeper in based on what their temperature needs are. Some stay out kind of a little more towards the mouth of the cave, and they overwinter there. They emerge in the spring, and they have something that's called delayed ovulation. So the female bats will basically not ovulate during the winter. They ovulate in the spring, and that's when the egg is fertilized from their activities, from the swarming and mating they had done back in the fall. So they actually delay that so that they are pregnant early on in the spring then. And then that's when they're heading out to search for their maternity roosts. And bats, for most part, most species are actually quite loyal to their past sites. So they will actually go back and try and find that same roost where they were at the spring, summer before. So these pregnant female, they find their roost sites in the spring and then have their pups in early summer. And the pups are actually able to start flying about 4 weeks after they're born. So they're just kind of getting learned to fly kind of early, midsummer. And then kind of late summer, the pups are able to be out flying. So they're in full flight kind of towards the end of August. And as this mentions on the slide, the females for most species, there's a couple exceptions, but most females will only give birth to 1 pup per year. So it's a very slow repopulation as opposed to something that could have a litter like of 10 to 12 young. Bats will only have 1 pup per year, sometimes twins, sometimes 2, but that's about it. So they really take care of their young to make sure that the resources, kind of the effort they put into giving birth and having that offspring, they try and make sure that pup does survive. So they take quite good care of their pups. I put this slide back in from the first intro slide. This is actually a new poster series that we just put out. It's Wild About Bats. We have a bunch of these posters now we have printed to just kind of, where our last one was a bit more dark and just the species there, and it didn't capture the attitude we're trying to portray for bats, the image we're trying to portray of bats. So I feel like this is a great image of a real bat habitat and some of the species we would find. So I put this up here because we do see a bunch of different habitats and how bats might use those areas. This kind of looks to be fall, so I would say the bats in the very back are swarming. They're kind of heading back to the hibernation site. We have some open field and open water areas, which is typically where bats would hunt. They catch insects at nighttime, so they need those open spaces, and over wetlands and stuff is actually quite a successful hunting grounds for them. And then we have a couple of bat houses, if you can notice in the bottom part of that image, that bats could make use of, but there's also the barn and the home in the picture, which is a kind of urban or rural setting where bats can make use of a bunch of different areas. Some bats will actually roost during the day, so where they go and hang out during the day when they're not in flying. Some of them will roost under tree bark, under rocks even in some places. So they make, depending on the species, there's quite a variety of habitat. And bats are definitely not just tied to rural areas. Bats can very easily make use of buildings and bridges and other structures in quite urban environments. Here in Ottawa, I see bats flying kind of right through downtown, and there's lots of areas and insects for them to feed on. So that's one thing I find neat about bats, is it can reach kind of a person in any setting. Like it's not like caribou, which are only in the further north areas. Pretty much anybody across the country, even in the northern areas, would have a chance to see a bat or have bats living in their community. So some of the threats, and this is kind of what I wanted to focus on, is some of the threats and what people can do today are, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of touched on white nose syndrome. So that's the real major impact. It's killed like millions of bats in Canada alone, leading to the listing of some of these bats being listed as endangered. Most hard hit are the little brown myotis, call it, the Northern Myotis, and tricolored bat. So those 3 are really hit hard, to the point where where it started in the East Coast, populations are dwindling to being almost non-existent in some areas. the little brown bat was actually one of the most common and widespread bats in kind of, Ottawa, Quebec, and eastward, and now it's one of the more rare ones to even see. So what happens is this disease, as I mentioned, the bats wake up in the winter a little bit to forage or for water. This fungus actually causes them to wake more often in the winter, which depletes their fat reserves, and then they can't survive. It also can cause some damage to their wings, and yeah, just leads to millions and millions of bat deaths. There's been some of the studies where the researchers have gone into caves where there are literally thousands of hibernating bats, and in the spring the floor unfortunately was just covered with piles. There were like literally only dozens of bats left from that past winter. So there is some research going into how to combat the disease. It's a very tricky balance because some fungi in caves are beneficial. This fungus obviously is not. So it's a very fine balance of like, do you spray? How do you treat the bats with making sure you keep that balance of the beneficial fungi in the cave sites. So there's some research going on in that. CWF ourselves aren't directly involved, but I wanted to also touch on some of these other threats that, for the bats that do survive the white nose syndrome, how do we reduce and kind of avoid some of these extra threats? So pesticides being one threat as well. For one, it reduces the insect population that the bats feed on, but secondarily, the insects that don't die from pesticides, that's what the bats are feeding on in some cases, in some areas. So we have bats that are eating treated insects in a sense. Wind turbines are also a factor, especially for those few migratory species. When bats get kind of close to the wind turbines, they actually don't have to come into contact with them. It's the change in pressure actually causes the bats to their blood vessels actually can't handle that quick pressure change, and they actually their vessels burst in some cases, and they die that way. So we've been advocating and talking about making sure we put wind turbines in appropriate areas that are away from bat flyways, which are unfortunately not well understood. So there's some studies going on to try and pinpoint where the high concentrations of bats would be, and it's based on bat biologists kind of have a general sense of where the bat habitat would be. So there's definitely a way to situate turbines appropriately. But one that I'm going to focus on also is habitat loss. So there's various ways to consider about habitat loss. One is direct deforestation or urbanization, removal directly of what would have been fields and forests of previous habitat. But as I mentioned, bats can still cope quite well in urban environments, so they've adapted over the years to our human-made structures. So another form of habitat loss can actually be kicking them out of our own structures. So there's certain ways to do that if people don't want bats in their houses, and there's certain ways that it can be extremely detrimental to the bats themselves. So we call them either evictions or exclusions for bats. So what would often happen is people find out they have bats in their houses, either in a barn or structure a house, and they want them to be no longer there, and they call a wildlife control company. What typically happens is the wildlife control company would put up, ideally, not kill the bats, would put up an exclusion netting which lets some bats come out. The bats fly out, but they can't get back up in this kind of black netting. The problem with this is if it's done at the wrong time of year, which is, as I mentioned, the mothers and the pups don't fly at that point. So when the mothers leave the roost and they can't get back in, the pups are trapped inside and they have no way to get out and no food source, so the mothers can't get back in. So that's something to bear in mind. So essentially, exclusion or removing bats from a structure is a form of habitat loss. So what can we be doing? What we're focusing on a lot is, as this slide mentions, is to change the dialogue, and that is actually happening. We're seeing it more and more, and not just CWF's own awareness, which we are trying to, make people aware of the benefits of bats and the services they provide, but and dispel some of those myths that people may negatively associate to bats. So there's a couple snippets of our organization, but also some others of the dialogue and the thinking that's going around. So to change the mindset that bats are actually an excellent pest control. A single bat can eat about 100 insects per hour and a night of foraging. A female bat, especially a female bat that has pups, that is either lactating or bearing a pup, can actually eat her entire body weight in insects in one night. And one of their food sources is mosquitoes. So we can think of bats as an excellent mosquito control for our backyards while we're sitting out by on our patios and that. So the thought that bats swoop into people's hair, I think, is more actually a fact that bats are coming in to eat the mosquitoes that are buzzing around us versus actually flying into somebody's hair. And it's actually, so some study, and a study was actually done to see about this, and a bat was let go in a closed room with strands of human hair hanging from the ceiling from above, and the bat was actually able to navigate a single strand using echolocation, a single strand of hair. So I think the theory that bats can fly into people's hair, I think they've got a much better sense of direction than we give them credit for. As I mentioned, I think before, the amount of what's considered ecosystem services, so the pest control that they offer the agricultural industry in Canada is well over $30 million per year just in the pest control. So they're eating the insects that would otherwise damage crops. So I think changing that mindset is really a first step to think of bats as a beneficial thing to have around and not something to be feared and misunderstood. So with that in mind, if we're thinking of bats in a new light, we can really ask ourselves the question, do we really need to evict a bat? Definitely, I understand, and I'm full agreement if there are bats causing damage to a house and in somebody's attic, then by all means, it's understandable if people want to evict them. But there's a right and a wrong way to do that when you're thinking of the bats in mind. So my top left picture, within those few bats, I think there's 2, 4, 6, 8 bats on the side of the brick wall. That's actually a bit more typical of a bat roost in an attic or in a soffit. From what I've heard from wildlife control companies, because of the declines, especially here in the east, there's not thousands and thousands of bats in a structure. Typically, we'd have 8 to 12 to 20 bats. Those bats may not be causing that much of a problem, and bats actually don't damage their structure. They don't chew wires. They don't kind of make a hole. They will just stay there. The concern would be the guano, the urine that they would produce. One option is to put down a drop sheet or kind of section off or partition within the space that the bats are in, and keep them there. And then you detract them from other areas. So you actually keep them contained in one spot, give them a space to be, and then they can eat your mosquitoes for you at night. One thing that we would kind of definitely, as I mentioned before, extermination or direct killing of bats because they're in your home. For one, under most laws throughout the country, it's illegal, and two, you're further further decimating a population that's already at risk. And I have heard this. I don't know if it's not probably easy to see, but it's probably almost better that way. The second kind of red circle on the bottom left there is a bat that's actually stuck in flypaper. We've actually had reports. Someone called us at one point to say that their wildlife control company was suggesting to hang flypaper in their attic to actually get rid of their bats, which just kind of boggles my mind to think that would even be a suggestion. But yeah, those two things definitely do not do. As on the right side is just as an example of what's considered a retrofit. So this is a large-scale building, but each one of those hanging, so this is looking upwards towards the rafters, each one of those hanging kind of plywood boxes are slats where bats could actually go up in and roost. So then same idea is you keep the bats to one section where you know they might be more preferable to stay. You can put in a drop sheet or seal it off so that there's not a mess, and it can be cleaned up that way. So as part of changing the dialogue and asking if you really need to evict a bat is to think about if you do need to evict, which as I said, completely understandable in some situations, make sure you ask the right questions of the people who are going to be doing that. As I had up the that kind of timing wheel of the life cycle of a bat, if bats are going to be evicted at the time that between the time the pups are born and before they're able to fly, essentially you're trapping baby bats and killing them in the attic. So make sure that the people who are doing the work are aware of those timing windows, and you can kind of either do the eviction in the spring, early spring, or wait till the end of summer and have them leave on their own, or over the winter you let them leave them on their own, and then seal it up in the fall. Now we're thinking eviction. If we're going to remove bats from a structure, we can also think about creating habitat. Whether we remove them or not, actually, we can think about creating habitat. So we've started a pilot project here in Ottawa. We're actually giving out and installing bat houses, which are kind of like a birdhouse. They're chambered sections or structures that can be put up to encourage bats to take up residence in these bat houses instead of your own house. There's actually plans on our website if anybody wants to check out helpthebats.ca. We have kind of a downloadable plan of how to build your own bat house, and a guide there as well as how to install it and all the specs that you can increase your chances of bats being present in that bat house. Not all bat houses are created equal. There's some on the market that are, there's studies that have shown certain specifications are better than others for increasing the likelihood of bats being in the bat house. So generally speaking, larger is better. So something that's wider and taller is more likely to be used than something that's narrow. And the more chambers you can have within there. So the kind of bottom middle photo shows different slats, and that's looking up into the bat house. So the bats will land on the kind of landing strip and crawl up in. And the more slats that are in there in little chambers, and these are only about 3/4 inches of an inch wide, each of these chambers. The more chambers provides more kind of temperature gradients, and the bats can move around and find their kind of ideal spot depending on the time of day. And obviously will hold more bats. There's depending on the size of the bat house, some of these bat houses can hold up to 300 bats. And the other thing, you'll notice that this bat house is painted black. So in our Canadian climate, the bats definitely want as much heat as they can get. So the black will absorb more heat. As well, we'd want to put them south facing so that the sun hits the bat house more often for a long period of time and warms it up a bit more. So that's the habitat creation thought of side of things. And then there's also citizen science that I'm going to talk about. So you've created habitat, or you've left your bats in your structure. Now what? So CWF has launched, or is kind of the lead organization behind iNaturalist.ca. It's a online platform and a web or a mobile app for iPhone and Android to record wildlife sightings. And it works, it's for not specific to bats, but it works really well for recording bat species. So pretty easy to use. You either take a picture either with your smartphone or digital camera. You can upload it to iNaturalist.ca. Using the app, it does it automatically, and it catalogs that occurrence that you've just taken and adds it to a global database. We have a project in iNaturalist of just bats, and as you can see, there's almost 500 observations of bats in Canada. But of all species that we have in Canada, we actually have we've hit over 1 million observations of different species across the country. We just launched it in 2015, so it's grown quite well. So the bat-specific project, though, that we have created is a way to record and monitor a bat house or a bat roost specifically. So within iNaturalist, people or anybody can create a project. So we have this project within iNaturalist for people to record their information about their bat roosts. Now, we also have a kind of guide or monitoring protocol that can be downloaded as well from helpthebats.ca, and it kind of outlines what you'd need to do to monitor your bat house, kind of the length of time you need to be out there, what you should do, what you should think about, how to position yourself. And then there's a monitoring data sheet, which is a paper sheet if people want to use it, but also this project on iNaturalist, whether you use the app or the website, has all these same fields, so you could enter it directly on the app or online. So you don't actually have to write anything down and transfer it after. You can do it in real time. The app works offline, and you have all that same information that you could just enter the information in. And normally iNaturalist is used for taking a photo of a species, a wildlife species. So we're suggesting people just take a picture of their bat house and post it up there, and we'd be able to track it that way. One of the things we're doing with our bat house project is to try and figure out what the dimensions are for like an ideal bat house. So we're asking people to put in the dimensions, and we're going to get this, ideally get this data set that we can run some analysis on to figure out what roost or bat house type is more likely to be used in Canada. A lot of the studies are done with bats in the US, where the climate's a little bit different. So if we can get a good data set of all the bat houses, whether they're used or not, and compare the different designs, we may actually be able to come up with what we could consider, an ideal or optimal design for our Canadian bat species. I should mention as well, so bats don't typically roost or overwinter in people's homes. There is one species, pretty much just one species, the big brown bat, that may overwinter in people's homes. So to bear in mind when we're thinking about evictions and removal, if people are finding bats in homes over the kind of getting into the winter, bats might leave around late October, November, but anything later than that, anything that gets evicted with those kind of exclusion one-way mesh doors that I showed a photo of, those bats wouldn't survive the winter. So ideally you'd leave them there for the winter, and then if you really need to, then you can think about it in the spring, where they would be able to head out and forage. I think that's all I have for the slides and the presentation I have, but I'm definitely open for some questions and can elaborate on any part of that as I'm able to.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the presentation you just gave us. And on behalf of our listeners, thanks for taking the time to tell us and share all your knowledge about bats. So thank you. To all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to type into the question section of the webinar dashboard. And I just want to remind everyone too that when you leave this presentation, there will be a quick 1-minute questionnaire that'll pop up. If you don't mind taking a minute to fill it out, that would really, we would really appreciate it, and helps us keep our Native Prairie Speaker Series going into the future. It looks like we have a couple of questions here. James, one person is wondering, about if they were to put up a bat house in their backyard, how can they deal with the guano?
Yeah, that's a good question. Depending on the use of the bat house, as I mentioned, typically the same thing with bats that are roosting in homes. There's not a huge colony that would likely take up residence. I mean, if you had 200 to 300 bats in your bat house, that'd be pretty impressive. If you have, 10 to 12 bats, you probably won't get much of a guano buildup. What I would suggest is maybe you could plant some low shrubs down around at the base, and that keeps kind of people away from getting coming into contact with it. Plus, guano is actually excellent fertilizer. There's a lot of companies that will actually source guano as a fertilizer source for crops. So that's one option. The other thing you could do is put a kind of a drop sheet down either along the ground or kind of higher up that's hanging that could catch the guano that way.
Interesting, thank you. A listener named Kenton would like to know, have you found large differences between species in regards to bat house designs and what works? For example, being colony versus more solitary species.
Yeah, definitely. So there is the bat houses that I was showing that are the chambered ones are more for those colony type bats. So we're kind of trying to focus on the little brown bat, which is one that would nest in colonies and in people's houses. There are other species of bats that are more solitary, so those would be less likely to use those kind of chambered bat house. There actually are some designs of what's considered, I don't know what they're called exactly, but like a bark layer that you actually strap it around a tree, and it kind of makes it like loose bark look to go off the tree, and that's where the solitary bats might nest. Or like cedar shingle homes, they kind of get up under those shingles, so you can that's a type of roost site that you might actually want to consider if you're looking at the solitary nesting bats.
Okay, interesting. Along those lines, a listener named Dina would like to know if there's a website that you recommend purchasing a bat house from. A good example, someone like me, I can't hit a nail on the head with a hammer. Putting together a bat house seems like a daunting task. Is there a way we can buy one?
Yeah, I find the problem, that's why I mentioned the sizing specs. A lot of the ones I find commercially are actually a little touch too small. Canadian Tire actually sells a bat house. It's not bad. It is a touch small. So if you're looking to increase the chances of being used, I think Bat Conservation International they're a US-based organization. They may have some. Ideally, actually, we do have the designs and hope to actually source somebody to start stocking. We have an online store at CWF. We did have some bat houses for sale there, but we don't have a consistent supplier. And those were larger bat houses that I think would be more ideal for bats. We just don't have any in stock and have to find a new supplier or a contractor to make them. But if someone's willing to kind of hold out a little bit, we may have some in our store online as well.
Okay, what is the best time of year to put up a bat house?
Really any time. It takes a bit of time sometimes for the bats to find it. So I would recommend getting it up as soon as possible, even if it's going to be in the fall and you think bats are going to be leaving for hibernation or migration. It'll be there when they get back, so they kind of get a bit habituated to it. They know it's there. They might check it out the next spring. To be useful for a maternity roost for female bats with pups. By this time of year, they probably already found their roost sites, so putting it up now won't likely become a maternity roost, but it could still be a secondary habitat. Depending on the species, like the little brown bat will actually switch roost sites from time to time. So throughout the summer, they'll use a couple of different spots. So even if they have their preferred spot, putting up a bat house, they may check it out and start using it. They may eventually start liking it. So really, I would say anytime. And yeah, it does take, sometimes it takes a few months to a year or so for bats to really get used to it and start using it. And honestly, if bats have a good habitat and a roost site they already like, there's not a huge draw for them to abandon that. If something that they know would like to go to a bat house, you know, it just to set people's expectations. If their own habitat doesn't change, they may just stick with where they are.
Okay. That's good to know. When installing a bat house, should it face a certain direction, like north, south, east, or west?
Yeah, definitely. We have a bit of a guide to bat house installation on our website at helpthebats.ca. I think it's being revamped, so it may not be there right yet, but it'll be there in the coming days or week. Yeah, so definitely south facing as much as possible. It needs to get ideally kind of 8 hours of sun a day. So it's definitely south facing as much as possible. And as I mentioned before, paint it black to absorb the sun a bit more. But also it should be a minimum of kind of 10 feet up. And the stats are out there that they're more likely to be used if they're actually right on a building versus on a tree. A pole is also can often be used as well, it's building is best, second best is on a post facing south, and third best, if you don't have those options, is to put it on a tree, but make sure that it's a tree that doesn't have a whole lot of low-hanging branches, because the bats won't either won't find the bat house, or it's too obstructed for them to swoop up in and land up in there.
Okay, thank you for that answer. A listener named Lucianne says, thanks for the great presentation, and they would like to know a little bit more if bats in Canada can be hosts of rabies.
Good question. So the answer to that is yes, but just like any other wildlife species. So the incidence of rabies in bats really isn't any higher than any other wildlife, like even cats, dogs, definitely not raccoons. So I think the rap that bats get with that tight association to rabies, I think the where that comes from actually is the bats that have rabies are actually more often found than the bats that don't, because they're acting erratically. They're actually kind of flying around or flopping around during the day. People bring them in, the bat gets tested, they find rabies, but the majority of bats actually don't carry rabies, and it's not any more likely than any other animal. So with any wildlife species, I would just recommend, don't handle wildlife unless you absolutely have to, and if you do, make sure you wear thick gloves and protect yourself that way.
Thank you. A listener named Riel says, thanks so much for this webinar. And she's read some information about, or some articles stating that bats tend to avoid artificial light, even artificial red light. Do you know if using headlamps would disrupt their behavior? And there's also another listener named Eric that would like to know if farmyard lights that are common in Saskatchewan here would impact bats.
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure about the type of different light, but I do know, so definitely if you're installing a bat house, I wouldn't put it near a light source. That would definitely deter them. And shining lights up into the bat house often would also be a deterrent. But it has been seen that bats would actually hunt and forage near some of the lights that actually attract a lot of the moths and other night-flying insects. So I would say they wouldn't roost near a light, but they actually may kind of hunt using the light that attracts insects. I would say if anybody needs to check on their bat house, shining a light up into it, maybe once a month wouldn't be too bad, just to see if it's being used. But other than that, I wouldn't be shining it up in too often.
Okay. The last question that we have here right now is, what is the duration of the gestation of a bat?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. And I think it would be, well, actually, no, I do somewhat. So the pups would be born, I can actually go back to my back to my slides here. Pups would be born. I mean, it really depends on the species too. I mean, there is a generalization, but I think different species will have a little bit of a different different timing. Pups could be born anywhere. Well, I guess it's pretty wide in that the life cycle I have there. But they would typically, as they emerge, their egg is fertilized in this early spring. Pups would be born probably early to mid-June. So probably I'd say roughly 2 months. But I would look that up to be certain.
Okay. And while you're on that slide, why do, or maybe it was a past slide, sorry, why do bats delay ovulation?
It's just a reproductive mechanism. So because they mate in the fall, they delay their ovulation to make sure that the egg is fertilized in the spring. So they don't want to be overwintering while pregnant because they're already on a pretty fine, say, calorie restriction, I'd say, because they need to live off their fat stores for the winter. So they don't want to be growing a pup at the same time as they're trying to overwinter and hibernate. But at the same time, they want their pups born early enough in the spring so that the pups are able to be flying by mid to late summer so they can forage, and then also the pups can then find their own hibernation site or follow them back to the hibernation site. So it's basically just a matter of really pretty cool strategy to make sure that they are able to have their pups in time for the pups to grow up, but also not having to be carrying a baby through the winter when they need every bit of fat storage that they can have.
Wow, that's really interesting. Wow. And can you tell us a little bit more about just your interest overall in bats? How did this happen? Other than the fact that bats are just cool.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the kind of just leading off, my focus has always just been species at risk in general, and bats kind of caught our radar when the white nose syndrome arrived in Canada, and bat populations were really declining. We were trying to push hard to make sure that these bats were recognized federally as a species at risk after they had been assessed to be in such decline. And so we were thinking, well, if the government's not listing them right away, what else can we do? So we started this awareness campaign. We kind of pushed it around the Halloween time, where we had a Halloween contest to get people aware of, bats are kind of fun and cool and not scary, and try and change the mindset that way. But I think since then I've really kind of taken a liking to these they're kind of mysterious. We don't see them often unless you really make an effort to find them at night. Yeah, they're just a neat, mysterious species that I find play an amazing role in our ecosystem that people often don't think of.
Yeah. Oh, it's so awesome. I've really enjoyed this webinar. We've had a couple more questions come in here, if that's okay. Listener named Rick would like to know, how long do the pups stay with the mom? You talked a lot about the resources that they invest into that one pup that they have every year.
Yeah, well, the pups, so the moms will teach the pups to fly. They'll take them out kind of mid to, well, more late summer. They do stay together right through till hibernation. And I think the moms will show the pups kind of how to get back to those hibernation sites, the swarm sites. I think once they hibernate over winter and then they leave the caves, they'll disperse a bit more after that, though.
Okay, interesting. And a listener named Eric would like to know, when do winter temperatures become dangerous for bats? When is too cold? When is it too cold, I guess?
That's a good question. I've actually posed this question before to other bat specialists, because we've had calls from people here in Ottawa that have said, "Oh, I've got a bat in my house, or I've seen one flying around at like minus 10 degrees Celsius." So I was looking into it, and it depends a bit on the species, but especially this one in particular, the big brown bat, which is one that would most likely overwinter in homes, will actually rouse and fly around for water at up to minus 10. They'll kind of do their bit to get some water and then head back in and go back into their torpor. So kind of minus 10 degrees sounds like roughly.
Oh, did we lose you there?
No, I'm still here.
Okay, good, perfect. And then our listener Rick was wondering again if bats migrate, where do they go down south, and how far?
That is a good question. I think I prefaced my my presentation that I'm not a bat specialist. This question, actually, I don't know how far they go. Yeah, I actually shouldn't venture a guess because I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. It's probably something that we're still learning about. We just don't know a lot about bats. And out west in Saskatchewan, where I live, we seem to still be learning about where they hibernate and where they migrate. And yeah, there's so many different species as well. It's really a complicated topic.
And it is quite tough to track bats, especially for that long distance. Bats, I mean, like birds, they weigh very little. So to put a tracker and a transmitter on a single bat to track one where it goes, I think it's been done, but yeah, it's definitely tricky to find something small enough that won't weigh the bat down, that has long enough battery life to track it that far.
Great, thank you. Thanks for answering all of our questions. I think that's everything that we have right now. So thank you so much for this awesome presentation, and thanks to all of our listeners out there for tuning in. So with that, I'll say have a great rest of your day, everyone, and be sure to check out the PCAP social media about our Native Prairie Appreciation Week. So thank you. Have a great day.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.